A lot of people don't need a hardcore SUV that can scramble up a hillside or splash through a mud puddle, but for those who do need that ability, we've got 5 of the most interesting players in the rugged off-roader segment. All 5 of these are diesel-powered 4x4s, and in the specs we have here, they're all 7-seaters as well, so they double down on the practicality front, and each of them has a close relationship with a dual-cab ute. So it'll be interesting to see whether they can live up to the family values of comfort and safety. Let's find out. Our contenders are the Ford Everest Ambiente, the Isuzu MU-X LS-M, Mitsubishi Pajero Sport Exceed, Toyota Fortuner GXL, and the all-new SsangYong Rexton Ultimate. Each of these cars is priced pretty closely to one another, between 49 and 55 grand. But it's interesting to note that we have a mix of spec levels here. Some entry-level cars, mid-specs and high grades. And the equipment levels vary because of that. So it'll be interesting to see how they stack up. We're going to look at practicality, safety, value for money, and of course, how they drive. Let's get started. First up, let's take a look at the practicality on offer. They all have 7 seats, but there's a big difference in how usable each is. We attempted to fit the same stuff in each of these SUVs, the CarsGuide pram and some suitcases. Read the full review for all boot capacity figures, but here's a quick look at the backsides of each of these buses. You can see for yourself the Fortuner's awkward side folding seats never allow you to use the full width of the boot, but it is deep. The Rexton's seats are okay, but not perfect. You have to load things on top of them, and there's a small covered section which can get in the way. The Pajero Sport has an intriguing third-row layout that means you have to flip the bases forward to lower the back seats. Other grades in the lineup only have 5 seats. The MU-X's third-row seats are second best of this bunch, but the high load lip at the back is something you may need to contend with. The best example is the Everest, which has a lower load-in height and flat folding rear seats. It offers pretty clever packaging, but bear in mind in base Ambiente spec, you need to spend an extra $1,000 to get third-row seats. We got Mitch to be our gopher and test each of the back seats of these vehicles for comfort and access. Now Mitch, you're about the size of a fully grown child.
About that, yeah.
Which was best and which was worst?
Well listen, while the Ford Everest has a really decent sized boot, when it comes to third row comfort, it's far from the best. The entry and exit is by far one of the worst, and that bouncy ride makes it almost unbearable. While in the Rexton, the visibility is non-existent and you feel very claustrophobic with the small windows and how close everything's packaged together. The Fortuner's actually pretty comfortable, but it is lacking space as well. By far, the Pajero Sport has the best third row seats for comfort, but I did find my legs are sitting a bit too high. My favourite has to be the MU-X. It's got space, headroom and comfortable seats. However, there are no rear vents in this spec, and that's an absolute killer in our Aussie summers.
Richard Berry's bigger than most people, so we put him in the back seat. In the second row of the Mitsubishi, things feel a little bit smaller than its rivals, with not much headroom. The seats are lovely though. In this grade, the Isuzu misses out on air vents in the second row as well as the back row. And the knee room, well, it's a little bit cramped. The Toyota's second row is mostly fine, but the leather feels a bit fake, and the plastics are harsher than the others here. Also, the door storage is hard to access when the door's actually shut. The SsangYong has amazing space on offer in terms of shoulder and headroom. The quality of the materials is the best of this bunch, and it even has a power point in the center console. Just a shame it's still a Korean plug. The best for second row comfort is the Everest, which is the only one with a sliding second row to allow for more third row space if it's needed. If you've got a family, every one of these SUVs has map pockets in the backs of the front seats, cup holders that fold down from the middle seat to varying degrees of usefulness, and bottle holders in the doors. And if you've got kids, each has ISOFIX child seat anchors and top tether points in the second row, while the Ford is the only one with 2 child seat points in the third row.
Can I get out now?
Let's take a look at some of the features up front in these family SUVs, and we'll start in the one with the most luxurious interior. You may not have expected it, but the SsangYong has the plushest interior by far. That's because we have the high-spec Ultimate model, which gets beautiful things like quilted leather across the dashboard and lovely leather seats. There's even quilting on the seats and on the doors. It looks fantastic. There's plenty to like here. Up front, you've got cooled seats and heated seats as well. Heated seats in the second row, a heated steering wheel, dual zone climate control. The list goes on. It's the only one of this mix with a sunroof, and you get a decent sized media screen with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, but there is no sat-nav, and annoyingly, there's no home screen. And on the screen, there's an out-of-body AI style weird reversing camera system. It's a 360 system, and it looks kind of hard to judge. The next most likable cabin is the Mitsubishi's. There's beautiful, comfortable leather seats up here, and the materials used are all of a good quality. The controls are simple to learn as well. You get a slightly smaller media screen, but you still get smartphone mirroring and digital radio, but again, no sat-nav. It does lack a little bit of loose item storage, but the controls are all nicely placed. And to all of us, it feels more like a proper family SUV than a ute-based off-roader. Third most likable on our list is the Ford Everest. In base Ambiente spec, it does feel a little bit affordable, but things like this big 8-inch media screen with Sync 3, sat-nav, Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, digital radio, all that stuff make it feel more upmarket than maybe the price tag suggests. But the plastics, the materials all feel a little bit ute-ish, and I guess that's to be expected of an entry-level SUV. But while the seats are cloth and affordable, they are very comfortable. The Toyota Fortuner's cabin is different enough to make it feel more family focused than the Hilux that it's based on. But there are some issues. The media screen is harder to use than any of the other screens here. The buttons are quite small, and it boggles the mind that Toyota won't let you control things like how to dial a number or pair a Bluetooth device when the car's moving. It's really annoying. You do get sat-nav and you do get a reversing camera, although the display is a touch pixelated compared to some of the others here. Like the Isuzu, there's a good amount of storage up front, but it does feel the most cramped of all these 5 SUVs in the front. Isuzu's MU-X feels hardy and work ready, and that's fine in a dual cab ute, but in this contest, well, it's not ideal. This is the entry-level model, so that's to be expected to a degree. But for not much more money, you can get a much more pleasant cabin in one of the other models here. But it does feel light and airy in here. And also, there's excellent storage across the dashboard and down next to the driver. Yes, there is a media screen, a touch screen, but it doesn't have sat-nav, it doesn't have Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, so it's basically just a display for the reversing camera. It's kind of redundant. There are parking sensors on all models, rear beepers for the Ford, Toyota and Isuzu, while the Mitsubishi and SsangYong add front sensors. The airbag count is led by the SsangYong, which has 9 in this spec. The Ford, Toyota and Mitsubishi have 7 airbags, while the Isuzu has 6. It misses out on driver's knee protection. When it comes to crash test ratings, there's a bit of a difference between all 5 of these models, so you might want to take the ANCAP scores with a grain of salt. Click the link in the description below to read the full story on their safety in each of these vehicles. Now let's talk powertrains. All of these SUVs are four-wheel drive and diesel powered, and there's just 13 kilowatts separating all five, but the torque difference is broader, with 50 Newton meters separating these contenders. It's the Ford that has the advantage in both respects, with the SsangYong's engine, the smallest capacity and offering the least torque. Each of them has an automatic transmission. The Toyota, Ford and Isuzu have 6-speed autos, the SsangYong uses a 7-speeder from Mercedes-Benz, and the Mitsubishi has an 8-speed box. Fuel use is close. All five claim between 8 and 8.6 litres per 100 Ks, with the Toyota officially thirstiest and the Mitsubishi the most frugal. During our testing we saw a slightly different story, but you'll have to read the review for all the details. The Fortuner feels the most truck-like of this mix, especially if there's only one of you on board. Its engine isn't a powerhouse, but it's not the laggiest of this group, and the transmission actually does a pretty good job of keeping it in its sweet spot. The transmission also has good grade logic when you're going down steep hills, and you've got paddle shifters which are very handy if you're going off-road or towing. The steering is direct and heavy at lower speeds. It does lighten up at higher speeds, but it's not the best of this group. But every one of our judges has found the body control to be pretty poor. It's both rolly in corners and also uncomfortably crunchy over bumpy sections of road. Not one of us has enjoyed driving the Fortuner. In fact, a few of us have looked forward to getting out of it. And those quibbles aren't confined to around town. It's also not the most comfortable on the open road either. The Toyota was crunchy and unsettled over potholed sections of gravel. It was really not a very pleasant place to be, and it struggled a little bit, surprisingly, up the steeper section of our real hardcore off-road track. The traction control just didn't do what it should. The throttle response was a bit too touchy as well. The SsangYong is a bit of a surprise in terms of its road manners. It's the most car-like to drive of these five SUVs, and it is firmer on the road in terms of the suspension. That means that you will feel a lot of the bumps that come up in the road surface, and that's mainly because it's got those big 20-inch wheels with low-profile tyres. I'd love to drive a Rexton on smaller wheels with bigger profile tyres. It could be a bit of a game changer for this vehicle. The steering is direct and weighty at higher speeds, but at lower speeds it can require a fair bit of arm twirling because the rack is a little bit slow. And the steering can also be a little bit twitchy if you hit a mid-corner bump. The Rexton's engine has the most lag of these five SUVs, especially when you're taking off from a standstill. You will notice that it's a bit sluggish and it can feel like it's struggling a little bit with the weight of the vehicle. But the transmission does a pretty good job. And although it is fairly livable when you're just driving around town or on the highway, the fuel use isn't the best. The SsangYong felt just as bad as we were all expecting. It feels more road focused, and off-road on a gravel track with lots and lots of pockmarks, it struggled immensely. On the hardcore section though, it was pretty well sorted. You needed to turn the traction control off to get up this steep incline, but it did a good job otherwise. The MU-X is a bit of a quiet achiever in this group. Well, not literally, it is quite noisy in here, but it's got really nice ride comfort. And I think that comes down to having smaller wheels with really big, chubby tyre sidewalls. The engine is refined, although it is pretty loud, and it does rev pretty smoothly, although the transmission can be a little bit confused at higher speeds. It'll want to choose between 4th, 5th and 6th and actually struggle to make that choice. The steering feels quite old school. It's got a lot of heft to it, and it means you do have to give it a fair bit of turning at lower speeds, but at higher speeds it's pretty trustworthy and you know exactly what's happening at the front axle. One common complaint that our testers have had is the seating position. You do sit up very high. Some people might like that, especially if you're short, but taller occupants like myself and Richard Berry have both found this a little bit uncomfortable in terms of how high up you sit. Plus, the steering wheel doesn't have reach adjustment and it feels like it's sitting way down low in your lap. It's easy to see why the MU-X is so popular with older people, younger people, and pretty much everyone. It's very, very popular and it can do this off-road. The Isuzu is brilliant over potholes and rough gravel surfaces at higher speeds. It's still a little bit skittish at the rear, but it has great tyres to deal with these rough conditions. And also in the serious off-road section, it was pretty well sorted, but it did spin up its tyres a little too easily. The Everest has the best engine of this bunch, even though it's the old one. It's not the new twin turbo, and it's got really good throttle response when you take off from a standstill. But the downside is this 5-cylinder unit is very noisy. The transmission is mostly good. It can be a little bit confused as to what gear it wants to be in at certain times, but for the most part it makes good use of the engine's torque. Fuel use has been pretty good on test, and we've found that it just doesn't feel as stressed. It's got a bigger capacity engine, and that makes it feel more relaxed under throttle. The steering is excellent. It feels so good. It's very light at low speeds. You can turn it with your pinky finger, and at higher speeds it feels nice as well. But in some ways it still feels very much like a truck. The brake pedal response is very soft, and I don't trust it as much as I trust some of the other vehicles in this test. The ride of the Everest is a bit of a mixed bag. It can be both sharp and jarring over broken back streets or country roads like we're on now, at lower speeds that is. At higher speeds it tends to feel a bit more floaty, and that means that it can be comfortable and it can also be a little bit uncomfortable. And while the driving position is pretty good in the Everest, one thing we wish for is reach adjust for the steering wheel. You don't get it here. The Ford Everest is the easiest to drive in the serious off-road terrain because the electronics are so smart. The traction control is finessed and measured in the way that it operates. Its steering is very light and lacks a little bit of feel, but the throttle response is extremely well sorted. On gravel roads, it was a little bit too soft though. The Pajero Sport has seats that are almost like sitting in a lounge chair. They're so comfortable, easily the most comfortable of these 5. And in general, the interior is a really nice place to be. The engine is decently quiet and pulls well, and the transmission does pretty much anything you ask of it. It's a smart drivetrain and it does a really nice job. One of the great things about the Pajero Sport in this spec is all the active safety assist systems that you get, but some of them can be oversensitive. The steering feel is quite good. There's a nice amount of weight to it, and it's also fairly direct and responsive too. And also the ride comfort is impressive for an SUV that's based on a ute. It doesn't bump around too much, it's not too sharp, although over some sharp edge bumps it can be a little bit jittery, but it's not on its own in that regard. On the whole, when it comes to road driving, this is a pretty impressive family bus. The Mitsubishi has a nice balance to it on gravel roads. It does teeter a little bit when you hit a big pothole, but it handles itself nicely when things get rough and ready. It eats up off-road terrain, and I didn't even need to turn off the traction control to get up this steep incline. There's really good flex to the suspension, and the throttle management is great. After days of testing on and off-road with all 7 seats in use and just one in use at some times, we've come to a decision. Obviously your decision will depend on what you value most, but we have to rank these cars as to what we think of them, and it was a difficult job this time around. At the bottom of the pile is the Toyota Fortuner and Isuzu MU-X. They both fall short in certain ways. The Fortuner on comfort and safety, and the Isuzu on safety and value. So they are at the bottom. In the middle is the SsangYong Rexton, which is amazing value. It's got pretty much everything you could possibly want, but it's not as off-roadable as it used to be, and that's its main letdown in this test. That leaves 2. The Ford Everest and the Mitsubishi Pajero Sport. We think that the Pajero Sport offers the best all-round package of these 5 SUVs. It's comfortable, it's composed, it's got good safety, and it's good value. The Everest does a lot of things right too, but in this spec, it doesn't quite make as much sense. So that leaves us with the Pajero Sport as our victor in this 5 SUV megatest. Click the link in the description for the full review and make sure you hit subscribe to stay up to date with all our latest reviews and comparisons.